The morning mist did not drift, it settled. It clung to the valley floor like a heavy gray shroud, muffling the sound of the world. In the village, the silence was absolute. No chimneys breathed, no hearths crackled. The frost had claimed the door frames and the window ledges, turning the wood brittle and white. John stood by the edge of the central plaza, his breath blooming in the air before vanishing into the damp chill. He watched the frost creep across the stone, a slow, relentless advance that had defined their lives for weeks. Beside him, Elias stared toward the jagged silhouette of Blackwood Hill. The peaks were sharp, biting into the low-hanging clouds. Everything was still. The water in the troughs had frozen solid, and the livestock pens remained empty. John shifted his weight, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots. He turned his head, searching for any break in the gray. John squinted, his eyes tracking the jagged line where the mountain met the sky. The mist swirled, thick and opaque, hiding the upper reaches of Blackwood Hill. He wiped the frost from his brow and leaned forward, his focus locked on a single point near the summit. Beside him, Elias stiffened. He held up a hand, signaling for absolute stillness. For a long moment, the only movement was the slow, rhythmic pulse of the fog. Then, a pocket of air cleared. A thin, dark plume of smoke detached itself from the gray backdrop, rising in a steady, vertical thread against the crags. It was faint, barely a smudge against the stone, but it was there. John held his breath. He watched the smoke drift, thin and fragile, yet persistent. It was not the gray of the mist or the deep shadow of the rock. It was a sign of combustion, a sign of heat. He looked at Elias, whose gaze was fixed on the same point, his jaw set hard. The plume wavered, thinned, and then surged upward again, defying the damp air of the valley. It was the first sign of life they had seen in weeks. The silence between them shifted, changing from the heavy weight of despair to the sharp electric tension of purpose. They did not need to speak. The smoke was a beacon. The smoke remained, a singular dark needle stitching the sky to the mountain. John turned away from the horizon, his eyes meeting Elias's. There was no need for discussion. The cold had stripped away the necessity of words, leaving only the raw, shared instinct for survival. Elias reached toward the shed, his fingers brushing against the rough, weathered wood of the wall. He tossed one to John, who caught it midair, the wood solid and heavy in his grip. John tested the weight, driving the tip into the frozen earth with a sharp, resonant thud. The wood held. Elias did the same, his knuckles pale as he gripped the handle, his posture shifting from the slump of exhaustion to the rigid, coiled tension of a hunter. They stepped forward, the rhythm of their boots striking the hard, frosted ground in perfect, unwavering unison. The slope rose abruptly, turning the easy stride of the valley into a grueling test of balance. John led, his walking stick sinking deep into the loose shale as he hauled himself upward. Elias followed, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Within minutes, the open trail vanished, replaced by a wall of dense, thorny brush that clung to the mountainside. The branches were stiff, hooked like claws. John pushed forward, feeling the sharp tips rake across his arms and legs. He gritted his teeth, refusing to slow his pace. A particularly thick cluster of briars blocked the narrow passage. Elias moved to the left, his stick snapping against a hidden rock. He stumbled, his shoulder catching a cluster of thorns that tore at his skin. He did not cry out. They were no longer walking. They were fighting the mountain for every foot of elevation gained. The 2-hour mark passed without notice, marked only by the burning ache in their thighs and the rhythmic rasp of their lungs. The slope had become a vertical scramble. John planted his stick, but the earth beneath it crumbled into a cascade of loose rock. He slid backward, his fingers clawing at the frozen soil. Elias lunged, his hand locking onto John's wrist, his own boot sliding inches from the precipice. They hung there for a heartbeat, the weight of the climb pulling at their strained muscles. Elias pulled, John scrambled, and they regained their footing on a narrow, jagged ledge. The air was thin, biting, and tasted of iron. They stood pressed against the rock face, waiting for their heart rates to slow, their chests heaving in the freezing wind. The summit remained a distant, taunting silhouette against the gray sky. There was no room for doubt, only the next step. John turned back to the slope, his movements slower now, heavier, but deliberate. Elias followed, his eyes fixed on the back of John's heels. The final stretch of the ascent was a brutal scramble over loose, shattered slate. John reached the crest first, his hands raw and trembling as he hauled his body onto the flat, wind-scoured plateau. He stood, legs shaking, and reached back to pull Elias up the final, jagged ledge. The wind hit them instantly, a relentless, freezing force that roared across the open peak. It whipped their hair and stung their faces, forcing them to lean into the gale just to remain upright. They stood on the highest point of Blackwood Hill, the world falling away in every direction. They scanned the horizon, searching for the source of the smoke they had seen from the village. There, nestled against a cluster of weathered boulders, stood a small, stone hut. It looked ancient, its walls gray and uneven, blending into the surrounding rock. The structure was silent, its roof sagging under the weight of years of storms. The wind whistled through gaps in the masonry, a low, mournful sound that echoed across the summit. They reached the threshold, stopped, and stared at the heavy wooden door. John pushed against the door. It groaned, the rusted hinges shrieking against the silence of the peak. He stepped inside, his boots scraping over grit and dried moss. The interior was a tomb of stale air and deep, absolute shadow. Elias followed, his presence a heavy weight in the cramped space. They stood still, waiting for their eyes to adjust to the dim light. The cold here was different. It was stagnant, pressing against their skin with a damp, heavy persistence. John took a cautious step forward, his hand brushing against a rough, uneven wall. He stopped. A faint, acrid scent drifted through the gloom, the unmistakable smell of wood smoke. It was thin, barely a ghost of a scent, but it pulled them toward the far corner of the room. As they reached the back wall, the darkness seemed to thin. There, nestled in a shallow depression, a small pile of dry debris lay in a heap. Beneath the ash, a cluster of embers pulsed with a deep, rhythmic red. The heat radiated a sharp warmth that defied the freezing air. John dropped to his knees, the grit of the floor digging into his skin. He did not look at the walls or the ceiling. His focus narrowed entirely to the small, pulsing heart of the fire. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the glowing coals. The heat bit into his palm, a sharp, stinging reminder of what they had lost. He pulled his hand back, his eyes wide and fixed on the rhythmic orange glow. The silence of the hut felt heavy, broken only by the faint, dry crackle of shifting debris. He turned his head, looking up at Elias, who stood like a shadow against the dim light of the door. "Our village hearths have been cold for weeks," John whispered, his voice raspy and thin. He pointed a trembling finger at the embers, his gaze intense. "Look at this. It is still alive. We have been shivering in the dark while this waited for us." He shifted his weight, his knuckles white as he gripped his knees. "We cannot leave it here to die. We must take this flame back. It is the only way to bring the warmth home." Elias stared down at the fire, his jaw set, the gravity of the task settling between them. Elias moved to the corner, his movements deliberate and slow. He reached into his pack and pulled out a handful of dried, curled leaves, brittle to the touch. He laid them flat on the ground, creating a makeshift cradle. John leaned in, his breath hitching as he prepared to move the coals. He used two thin, flat stones as makeshift tongs, sliding them beneath the glowing core. The heat radiated outward, warming his face, but he kept his focus locked on the delicate task. He lifted the first cluster of embers. They were fragile, crumbling at the edges into fine, gray dust. As he lowered them onto the leaves, a stray spark jumped, singeing the edge of the dry foliage. John froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He held his breath, waiting to see if the entire bundle would flare into flame. It did not. The spark died, leaving a tiny black pinprick on the leaf. He exhaled, his shoulders dropping. They worked in tandem now, John guiding the stones while Elias tucked the edges of the leaves inward, folding them over to insulate the heat. They moved with the precision of surgeons, scooping the remaining glowing fragments until the bundle was full. The weight was minimal, but the danger of the task made the small package feel heavy with consequence. Elias reached for a sturdy, weathered branch he had cleared of twigs earlier. He held it out, steadying his hands as John carefully lifted the leaf-wrapped bundle. The transition was agonizingly slow. John lowered the package, centering it on the wood. The leaves sagged under the heat, threatening to spill the coals. Elias adjusted his grip, tilting the branch to find the center of gravity. It wobbled, the embers shifting inside the dry foliage with a soft, dry rustle. He held it perfectly still, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the balance. The branch flexed, a slight groan of wood against wood. and for a heartbeat the bundle tipped. John caught the edge with his fingertips, steadying the load before it could slide. They stood motionless, the branch held out between them like a fragile, glowing offering. Their faces were tight, lines of strain etched deep around their mouths. There was no room for error now. The heat seeped into the wood, turning the bark warm to the touch. Elias looked at John, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. They were no longer just two men in a hut. They were the sole guardians of a dying light. They took a collective breath, locking their shoulders, and turned toward the open door. Every movement from here on out would be a gamble against the wind. They crossed the threshold, the sudden rush of cool air hitting their faces like a physical blow. The summit was no longer the quiet sanctuary it had been moments ago. John stepped out first, his boots crunching on the loose shale, his eyes scanning the horizon. Above, the sky had shifted. The clear blue of the afternoon had vanished, replaced by a deep, bruised purple that bled across the clouds. It was a warning, silent and absolute. Elias followed close behind, his gaze fixed on the bundle of leaves. He felt the vibration of the mountain beneath his feet, a low hum that signaled the coming pressure. They did not speak. The descent was narrow, winding between jagged rocks that jutted out like broken teeth. John took the lead, testing each foothold with the tip of his stick. Behind him, Elias kept his arms locked, holding the branch steady against the shifting gravity of the slope. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone. They moved downward while the light faded rapidly into the encroaching gloom. The storm was not just coming, it was already here. The ridge narrowed until there was barely enough room for two men to stand side by side. As they stepped onto the exposed spine of the mountain, the wind changed. It no longer whistled. It roared. It came in long, rhythmic surges that hammered against their chests. John felt the pressure pull at his balance, his boots sliding on the slick, moss-covered stone. He shifted his weight, digging his heels into the dirt to stay upright. Between them, the bundle of leaves began to tremble. The dry foliage rattled violently, and a thin trail of gray smoke whipped away into the void. Elias tightened his grip on the branch, his knuckles straining against the wood. He turned his back to the oncoming gale, creating a wall with his own body. The wind shrieked, finding every gap in their defense. It pushed against the leaves, forcing the glowing center to pulse with a dangerous, frantic light. John reached out, shielding the top of the bundle with his palm, feeling the searing heat radiate through his skin. They moved forward, inch by agonizing inch, their bodies locked in a rigid protective cage around the fire. The air grew colder, but the heat from the coals burned steady. The rhythm of the wind broke. It ceased its rhythmic howling and vanished, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. John and Elias stopped instantly, their boots locking onto the rock. They knew the stillness was a precursor to something worse. Then, it arrived. A sudden, violent gust slammed into the slope, hitting them with the force of a physical blow. It did not come from the front. It spiraled up from the valley, catching the bundle of leaves in a chaotic vortex. The men froze, their bodies rigid, bracing against the sudden shift in gravity. The air pressure dropped so sharply that John felt his ears pop. Every muscle in his arms tightened as he fought to keep the branch level. The embers inside the bundle flared, casting a frantic, dancing light. The wind whipped around their heads, tearing at their hair and stinging their eyes with grit. They stood motionless, trapped on the narrow ledge. The fire was no longer just a burden, it was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. They held their breath, listening to the mountain groan. The gust did not pass. It intensified, turning into a sustained, punishing roar that threatened to peel them from the rock face. John felt his knees buckle under the sheer weight of the air. He dropped, hitting the jagged stone hard, his focus narrowing until the entire world became the bundle of leaves in his hands. He cupped his palms around the fragile nest, his fingers pressing into the dry debris to create a seal. The glow inside the bundle flickered, turning from a steady orange to a dying, translucent gray. The heat against his skin vanished. Panic surged, sharp and cold. As he realized the embers were losing their grip on the wood, he pressed his face closer to his hands, shielding the tiny, fading light with his own body. Every breath he took was shallow, careful not to disturb the air around the coals. He felt the grit of the mountain floor beneath his palms, the vibration of the wind shaking the very stone he knelt upon. The fire was fading, the edges of the leaves turning to ash in the freezing draft. He squeezed his hands tighter, forcing his own warmth into the space between his palms. He did not look up, he did not move. He only felt for the faint, pulsing heat of the coals, waiting for a sign that the spark was still alive. The silence of the dying fire was louder than the storm. Elias saw the gray ash spreading across the leaves. He did not hesitate. He stepped forward, planting his feet wide against the uneven rock to anchor himself against the gale. With a sharp, decisive motion, he pulled his heavy outer layer taut, stretching the fabric wide to create a wall against the wind. He stepped directly into the path of the blast, his back to the mountain, his frame acting as a solid barrier. The wind hit him with a hollow thud, the fabric snapping and whipping, but the space behind him felt instantly still. John felt the sudden absence of the freezing draft. He looked up, seeing Elias braced against the assault, his shoulders locked and his jaw set against the pressure. The air behind the shield grew heavy and stagnant, but it was safe. The gray ash on the leaves began to recede, replaced by a faint, returning glow as the embers caught the oxygen trapped in the pocket. Elias did not move. He stood rigid, absorbing the full weight of the storm, his muscles straining to maintain the angle of the barrier. He leaned into the wind, his boots scraping for purchase on the loose shale. The roar of the mountain continued, but the flame held. He kept his position, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the wind to break, his body a silent, immovable anchor for the light. The wind slackened just enough to allow movement. Elias stepped back, keeping the fabric angled to maintain the pocket of still air around the bundle. John rose slowly, his hands locked around the branch, keeping the glowing leaves steady. They moved in tandem, a single unit navigating the jagged descent. John took the lead, his eyes scanning the ground for loose shale and hidden gaps between the rocks. Elias followed half a step behind, his body angled to catch the residual gusts. When they reached a narrow, slick section of the path, they stopped. John tested the surface with his boot, feeling for stability. He signaled with a sharp nod, and they stepped forward together. John navigated the drop, his movements deliberate and slow, while Elias adjusted the shield to compensate for the shifting angle of the slope. They moved with a practiced, silent rhythm. Every time John shifted his weight to avoid a sharp outcropping, Elias mirrored the motion, ensuring the flame remained protected from the turbulent air. They did not speak. The terrain demanded total focus. They stepped over a deep crevice, their feet landing in unison on the solid ground beyond. The path narrowed into a jagged spine of rock that forced them to slow their pace to a crawl. John gripped the branch with both hands, his fingers locked tight around the rough wood. The weight of the bundle felt heavier with every passing meter, pulling at his shoulders and straining his forearms. Elias kept his hands pressed against the base of the branch, providing a steadying force that prevented the embers from swaying. They moved with agonizing slowness, their muscles burning from the constant tension required to keep the flame level. A sudden shift in the terrain forced John to pivot, his weight shifting sharply onto his right leg. He held the branch steady, his knuckles turning white from the intense pressure of his grip. Elias mirrored the movement. They did not loosen their grip, not even for a second, as they navigated the final, treacherous stretch of the ridge. The descent grew steeper, the ground beneath them composed of loose shale and slick, rain-dampened soil. John placed his front foot down, but the earth gave way under his boot, sliding out from beneath him. He lurched forward, his momentum carrying him into a sudden, uncontrolled stumble. The jolt traveled straight up his arms, vibrating through the wood of the branch. Elias felt the shift instantly, his own footing compromised as he tried to stabilize his partner. The wood groaned under the sudden, uneven distribution of force. A sharp, dry crack echoed against the cliffside as the branch fractured near the middle. The structure buckled. The bundle, heavy with the weight of the glowing embers, began to sag, tilting violently toward the dark, damp earth below. John felt the wood give way entirely in his grip, the fibers splintering under the immense pressure of their combined, panicked resistance. The bundle dipped, the glowing core exposed to the open air, sliding downward as the support failed. Gravity took hold. Elias did not think. He dropped his own end of the broken wood and lunged. His body hit the slope with a dull thud, his fingers clawing into the loose shale as he reached for the falling bundle. The embers were a heartbeat away from the damp soil, the heat radiating against his palm as he intercepted the weight. He caught the bundle mid-air, his knuckles slamming into the dirt, but the fire remained contained within the leaves. He held his breath, his chest pressed firmly against the cold ground, shielding the glowing core with his own body. John scrambled down beside him, his hands hovering, ready to assist, but frozen by the suddenness of the save. Elias grunted, the muscles in his shoulder bunching as he pushed himself upright, keeping the bundle cradled against his chest. He stood, his knees shaking, and held the salvaged prize out toward John. The embers pulsed with a steady, deep red light, miraculously intact. Neither man spoke. They looked at the path ahead, then back at the fire. With a shared nod, they turned back toward the valley, moving with renewed, desperate precision. They moved with a rhythmic, agonizing pace. Every step sent a jolt of fatigue through their legs, the muscles screaming for rest, but neither man slowed. John felt his lungs burning, each intake of air sharp and shallow, as if he were breathing in needles. The fire, cradled carefully between them, remained the only focus. They ignored the sweat stinging their eyes and the tremors in their hands. Elias kept his gaze fixed on the path, his breath coming in ragged, forced gasps. The slope seemed to grow steeper, the ground uneven and unforgiving, yet they pressed on with a singular, desperate intent. Their bodies were failing, but the heat of the embers against their palms served as a constant, searing reminder of the task. They navigated a narrow ledge, their boots skidding on loose gravel, but they corrected their balance instantly, never letting the bundle tilt. The pain in their chests deepened, a dull, heavy ache that threatened to overwhelm their resolve. They did not speak. Words were a luxury they could not afford. They pushed past the limits of their endurance, their movement becoming mechanical. The path ahead twisted downward into the deepening shadows. The descent became a blur of sliding shale and tangled roots. John felt the ground level out beneath his boots, the steep incline finally giving way to the flatter terrain of the valley floor. The air grew thicker, losing the biting chill of the high peak. They pushed through a final, dense wall of pine branches, the needles scraping against their arms and faces. Suddenly, the darkness of the forest canopy broke. The trees thinned, revealing a wide, open expanse of graying fields. John stumbled forward, his eyes scanning the horizon until they locked onto the silhouette of the village gates. They stood stark and silent against the bruised, purple sky. The sight pulled them forward, a beacon of reality after the isolation of the heights. Elias let out a ragged, uneven breath, his grip on the branch tightening, as he realized the distance remaining. The village was there, nestled in the valley, still and waiting. They were no longer fighting the mountain. They were now racing the fading light. The path ahead was clear, a straight, hard-packed track leading directly to the wooden barricades. They stepped out from the shadows of the trees and began to move. The transition from the forest edge to the open track was immediate. John felt the ground harden under his boots, the soft soil of the woods replaced by the packed earth of the village approach. He looked at Elias, and without a word, they accelerated. The steady pace they had maintained for hours shattered into a desperate, lung-tearing sprint. Every muscle in their legs burned with the sudden demand for speed. John opened his mouth to shout, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He forced more air into his chest, his throat raw from the cold mountain wind. "Fire!" he finally managed to yell, the word cracking in the stillness of the valley. Elias joined him, his voice a hoarse, ragged cry that cut through the gloom. They ran with their heads down, eyes locked on the wooden gates ahead. The bundle of embers bobbed violently between them, a fragile, glowing weight that threatened to spill with every jarring stride. They ignored the stabbing pain in their sides and the heaviness of their limbs. The distance to the gate began to close, the wooden timbers looming larger with every frantic step. They shouted again, a rhythmic, desperate chorus of sound intended to pierce the quiet of the village. The final 100 yards stretched out before them. The heavy wooden gates swung wide, and they stumbled into the central plaza. The transition was jarring. The wind that had whipped at them on the mountain slope died instantly, replaced by the stagnant, cold air of the village square. John felt the sudden lack of resistance as they slowed to a halt. His legs trembled, threatening to buckle under the weight of his own exhaustion. Around them, the darkness of the plaza began to shift. Figures emerged from the shadows of the nearby dwellings, their movements hesitant and slow. John did not look at them. He kept his eyes locked on the stone-lined pit at the center of the square. It was empty, a hollow circle of cold earth waiting for the spark. He and Elias moved forward, their steps measured and heavy. Every muscle in their arms ached from the hours of holding the branch steady. They reached the edge of the pit and stopped. The silence in the square was absolute, a heavy pressure that seemed to weigh more than the mountain air. John exhaled, a long, shaky breath that clouded in the night. He looked at Elias, who nodded once, his jaw set. Together, they leaned over the pit. The glowing leaves made contact with the dry debris in the pit. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The embers sat dull and gray against the tinder, the thin wisps of smoke curling lazily into the cold air. John held his breath, his hands still locked around the branch, his knuckles raw and scraped. Beside him, Elias leaned in, his eyes fixed on the point of contact. Then, a single tiny spark jumped. A thin line of red crept along the wood. It widened. The wood hissed, a sharp, sudden sound. A small flame flickered, turned blue, then deepened into a vibrant, pulsing orange. It caught the surrounding debris with a sudden, hungry intensity. The fire leaped, climbing rapidly. The pit was no longer a hollow circle of cold earth. It was a living, breathing source of warmth. The roar of the fire was the first sound to break the stillness. It crackled, a sharp, rhythmic snapping that echoed off the surrounding stone walls. For a moment, the villagers stood rooted, their eyes wide, reflecting the sudden, brilliant orange light. Then, the silence shattered. A single voice shouted, raw and high, followed by another, and then a collective surge of sound that rose like a tide. Cheers erupted from every corner of the plaza. The noise was physical, a wall of sound that pushed against the lingering cold. People stepped forward, their faces illuminated by the dancing glow. The darkness that had pressed down on the village for weeks was pushed back, retreating into the edges of the square. John and Elias stood at the center, their bodies swaying with exhaustion, yet they remained upright. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with the energy of the crowd. They watched as the villagers pressed closer, a sea of movement and noise, their voices blending into a single triumphant cry. The air in the plaza, once stagnant and freezing, now carried the sharp, clean scent of wood smoke and the heat of the growing blaze. The long, desperate climb was over. The crowd surged forward, a mass of movement pressing toward the central pit. People reached out with sticks, dry branches, and bundles of straw, eager to catch a piece of the flame. The first woman stepped up, thrusting a thin branch into the heart of the blaze. It caught instantly. She pulled it back, the wood hissing as a bright yellow tongue of fire licked the air. She turned, and a man beside her leaned in, touching his own bundle of twigs to hers. The fire jumped the gap. He stepped away, his torch now burning, steady and strong. The process repeated, a chain reaction of light spreading through the plaza. One by one, the villagers held their torches aloft, the flames dancing in the wind. The darkness that had clung to the corners of the square vanished, replaced by the flickering orange glow of dozens of individual fires. Children darted between the adults. The air grew thick with the smell of burning pine and dry leaves. Every person in the plaza now held a piece of the summit fire, a small, portable sun that pushed the shadows further back. The warmth moved outward, reaching the stone walls, the heavy wooden gates, and the faces of the people who had waited so long for this moment. The plaza was no longer a place of cold, but a hearth for the entire community. John took a step back, his boots dragging against the stone floor of the plaza. He leaned his weight against a nearby wall, the rough surface biting into his shoulder. Beside him, Elias did the same, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. They watched the flickering light dance across the faces of the villagers, but their focus was inward, centered on the sudden, heavy silence of their own bodies. John looked down at his hands. They were mapped with black soot, the fine dust ground deep into his skin and under his nails. He tried to clench his fingers into a fist, but they refused to obey. A fine, rhythmic tremor started at his wrists and traveled up his forearms. Elias held his own hands out, watching them shake with the same involuntary motion. The adrenaline that had carried them down the mountain was draining away, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue. They did not speak. There was no need for words. They simply stood in the shadows of the outer square, watching the warmth they had retrieved flow through the community. Every muscle in their legs felt like lead, and their knees buckled slightly with every shift of weight. The tremors in their hands finally slowed, replaced by a steady, pulsing warmth that seemed to radiate from the central pit. John turned his head, watching the orange light wash over the plaza. The shadows that had defined the village for weeks were gone. Elias shifted his weight, his feet finally finding a firm, relaxed stance on the stone. A villager walked past them, pausing only to place a hand briefly on his shoulder before moving on to feed the flames. John looked at Elias. The exhaustion was still there, etched into the lines around their eyes, but the tension had vanished. The firelight caught their faces, highlighting the soot-stained skin and the steady, focused gaze they shared. They were simply present, breathing in the warmth of a hearth that would burn through the night. They stood together, watching the sparks rise toward the dark sky, their expressions settling into a deep, unshakable satisfaction. They remained there, rooted in the center of the restored life, watching the orange glow turn their faces into masks of quiet triumph.